a mechanical genius who never made it to high school, but one who would eventually create the world's most important automobile. His vision was so strong that few of his contemporaries even believed in it. Even after generating billions of dollars for his company, he had to wrestle control away from investors to have his way. Now, though, his name is synonymous with the word car, and he is remembered as one of the greatest innovators of all time. This is the story of Henry Ford. Chapter 1. From Bicycles to Engines. In 1863, on a farm in the southeast corner of Michigan, Henry Ford was born. His parents were both second-generation immigrants, coming from England and Belgium. Henry grew up in a modest family, with 4 siblings, and attended school until the 8th grade, dropping out before making it to high school. But that didn't mean his brain wasn't active. As a young boy, he would take apart machines to understand how they worked, which earned him a handful of jobs fixing family members' watches. His greatest fascination, though, was road engines, which were revolutionary at the time. Meanwhile, his father was preparing Henry to take over the farm. Henry enjoyed the mechanical much more than the manual, leading him away from farm life and into the city of Detroit to take on an apprenticeship as a machinist. Over the next half a decade, Henry became masterfully knowledgeable about machinery, especially the Westinghouse portable steam engine, which allowed his family's farm to gain the benefits of steam power. This led to a job with Westinghouse as a serviceman, repairing faulty and broken-down units. Henry married in 1888 Clara Bryant when he was 25 years old. Having moved back onto the family farm, they stayed for less than a year before Henry became restless. His real passion was for innovating products of his own. Ford went on to Westinghouse's rival Edison's company in Detroit to a much higher paid position as an engineer. This is where he would gain his greatest inspiration. Privately, he began working on a 2-cylinder 4-horsepower motor that powered his very first motor car, completed in 1892. It utilized a countershaft and chain to generate speeds up to 20 miles per hour. Despite never going to university, he was proving himself to his superiors at Edison Illuminating Company and climbed the ranks quickly. Within 2 years of working there, he was promoted to chief engineer. And in a small workshop at the back of Henry and Clara's house in Detroit, he was spending all his free time working on an automobile, believing that gas power was the future, rather than electricity of Westinghouse, Edison, and Tesla. By 1896, he had developed his first self-propelled vehicle, which he named the quadricycle. It was powered by pure ethanol and was essentially a horse carriage with 4 bicycle wheels and an engine powering the rear wheels, steered by a lever. The first Ford quadricycle was sold for $200, equivalent to almost $7,000 today. This was Henry's first motor car sold, but it still had a long way to go before it would become the Ford that we know today. Chapter 2. Going Alone. Working at the Edison Illuminating Company helped Henry Ford fund his first automotive experiments, and in 1896, after he had built his quadricycle, he was introduced to Thomas Edison himself, who praised Henry's innovation. By this time, he had made a second model, and Edison's recognition was a huge motivation for Henry to gamble on himself. With the tick of approval from one of the time's greatest mechanical minds, Henry felt confident going alone and leaving the company. Edison offered him $1,900 a year to stay, almost double the average salary at the time, and equal to almost $70,000 today. But Henry believed in his vision. It was a big risk, and Henry was going to need to attract much more investment than he had in savings. He secured the backing of an investor named William H. Murphy, after taking him on a 60-mile test drive in one of his vehicles. With that, the Detroit Automobile Company was born. Henry rolled out the company's first product, a delivery wagon. But his investors had different ideas. They wanted to diversify the product range and scale up the operation. against Henry's wishes. The result was badly manufactured cars at a higher price than Henry wanted. And so, in late 1990, less than a year after founding the company, he left. Instead, Henry joined forces with a group of friends, working non-stop to build one of the most iconic automobiles of his lifetime. Aided by some former stockholders who had followed Henry after he left, the team constructed a two-cylinder, 26-horsepower, lightweight racer. Henry himself drove the car to win a race at Grosse Pointe against a 40-horsepower machine, a huge feat at the time. This made Henry famous in the automobile world. He was an up-and-coming engineer, and his success on the racetrack was enough to earn him the backing of a number of other former Detroit automobile company, who gathered behind him once again to form the Henry Ford Company in 1901. But this too was an ill-fated enterprise. Once again, they found their visions drastically diverging. By now, Henry wanted to focus on building a four-cylinder racing car, while the rest of the investors wanted a smaller, lightweight, and affordable car to roll out to the mass market. For the second time, Henry parted company and took his name with him. The existing company rebranded as the Cadillac Automobile Company, while Henry went on to forge his own path, with the value of his name now at an all-time high. Chapter 3: First Models. In 1902, working together with a bicycle racer named Tom Cooper in a workshop in downtown Detroit, Henry built the Ford 999, which had a huge engine and produced up to 100 horsepower. The 999 went on to win the Manufacturer's Challenge Cup, drawing the interest of a man named Alexander Malcolmson, a wealthy Detroit coal dealer, and the two struck up a partnership. The following year, Ford and Malcolmson incorporated with the name Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford received the most shares, tied equally with Malcolmson, followed by a coal maker, John S. Gray, and 12 other stockholders. Even in their year, the Ford Motor Company was a roaring success, recording $37,000 in profits after just months of business. But tensions inside the operation began to emerge. Despite the record profits and dividends being paid to shareholders, once again, Henry found himself fighting with stockholders about the future of the company. Once his close partner, Henry found himself clashing with Malcolmson. But Henry was not going to let this operation slip out of his control as his two earlier companies had. He rallied the support of John S. Gray and other investors, coordinating an attack to freeze Malcolmson out of the company. Malcolmson was forced to sell his shares to Henry, and later that year died, making Henry Ford the undisputed leader of his company for the first time. At least for now. The company secured early funding in 1903, but it was all hedged on the success of the Ford Model A, released the same year. The Model A was a two-cylinder, 16,068cc, 1,200-pound automobile with a top speed of 28 miles per hour. The price was set at $750, which would be $26,000 today. Coated with a shiny red on its wooden frame, the Model A was marketed as the most reliable machine in the world. The Model A turned a profit, but $750 was a higher price than its rival, the Oldsmobile Curved Dash. It would take Henry more than a dozen and a half models to find the sweet spot for consumers. Over the next few years, Henry released other models like the six-cylinder Gentleman's Roadster, the Model K, and a front-engine 15-horsepower Model N. But undoubtedly, the most successful of these was the Model T, which Henry Ford developed in 1908. This model would catapult the company to global industrial success. First, though, he needed to make a workforce fit for the task. Chapter 4: The Assembly Line. Henry Ford was constantly thinking about how he could lower the cost of production. One half were materials and logistics, but the other half was creating a more efficient workforce. With the Model N, different components of the car were laid out on the floor of the factory and dragged along the floor on skids as each department worked on it. This was a laborious task, but it was improving efficiency, a game of trial and error that would soon lead to Ford's greatest successes. This was designed to divide labor into hyper-specialized jobs, and with the Model T, Ford took this to a level unprecedented in history. The car's production was broken up into 84 different steps, and workers were trained only for one step. He brought in a man named Frederick Taylor as a consultant. Rather than a standard business management consultant, Taylor was an expert in movement and industrial efficiency. He systematically broke down each component of the workplace to make it a scientific operation. Arguably, one of Ford's greatest technological innovations in the factory was a moving chassis assembly line, getting rid of manually moved skids and allowing for a robotic-like workforce. By the following year, a belt was pulling components along at a rate of 6 feet per minute, and when the pace increased, so too did production. Incredibly, this meant that a brand new Model T could be assembled in just 90 minutes. Every part of the car was designed for speed in production. Whereas earlier Ford models were available in different colors, the Model T was only produced in black. Through testing, Henry found that only the Japan black varnish was able to dry quickly enough to keep up with the pace of production. He was interested in innovating the workforce as much as he was automobiles. To match his brand new machinery and ever-growing car production, he needed to improve the working environments. Workers were leaving his company in droves, complaining about the repetitive, boring nature of the assembly line work. Before they had constructed entire vehicles, but now they would work on only one task each day. To maintain a stable group of workers, to avoid having to consistently rehire and retrain, Ford offered the most competitive rate in the industry, $5 a day for 8-hour workdays. This was more than twice the going rate, with fewer work hours in the day. In the context of widespread unemployment, this attracted tens of thousands of workers to swarm the Model T plant in Highland Park, desperate for jobs. And a decade later, Ford became one of the first companies to introduce the 40-hour, 5-day work week, finding that employees became more efficient. Ford's philosophy was also to give his workers enough to afford to buy the products they were creating, thereby creating even more customers. Henry Ford said publicly, "We believe in making 25,000 men prosperous and contented rather than follow the plan of making a few slave drivers in our establishment multimillionaires." But he admitted that it was instituted to boost productivity. Having workers around for fewer hours but working harder increased their output. Fordism soon spread to other industries, because it worked. Chapter 5: Fighting for Success. Immediately after the launch of the Ford Model T, the company received 15,000 orders, signaling the future the company was in for. But even Henry couldn't have imagined how huge their success would grow. When production ended 13 years later, 15.5 million Model Ts had been produced, which still ranks as one of the best-selling cars of all time. Ford had become the biggest American car manufacturer, and at times, an estimated 50% of all cars in the country were Model Ts. Of course, this translates into huge profits for the company too. Just 3 years after its release, the Ford Motor Company had a capital surplus of a staggering $60 million, equivalent to $1.6 billion when adjusted for inflation. But this great success brought problems that were all too familiar. Again, Henry Ford's vision conflicted with his stockholders. This time, though, it would be immortalized in law, when John Francis and Horace Elgin Dodge took Henry to court. Together, they owned 10% of the company, the largest after Henry, and they opposed Henry's investments in new plants and the plans to end special dividends. Seeing the tens of millions of dollars accumulate, the Dodge brothers wanted cash in hand rather than a long-term investment, and the Michigan Supreme Court agreed, awarding them $19 million in dividends. $500 million today. Henry was enraged. His vision for greater production facilities and global domination was being stunted. He threatened to leave the company and set up another unless he was able to gain full control of the company. Henry paid a total of $125 million in what today would be over $2.24 billion. He was forced to take out loans to raise the money. Success was now a necessity, and his entire net worth was tied to the company. But it meant that finally, almost 20 years after his first business venture, Henry Ford was in full control of his company. Chapter 6: A Dirty Business. Under Henry's undivided leadership, the company rapidly expanded, acquiring the Lincoln Motor Company and moving to the Brazilian, German, and Soviet markets. Some of these markets were marred. Henry collaborated closely with the Nazi government, ordering the removal of Jewish managers in their German plants, aiding the production of Nazi machinery, and on the eve of World War II, he even refused to build airplanes for the Allies. Even when the German plant was taken over by Nazi management, Ford maintained the majority of profits. When war did break out in Europe, though, Henry was on the brink of death, and his son Edsel Ford was in charge. In contrast to his father, whose official stance was to remain neutral, Edsel chose to join the war effort and produce hundreds of thousands of tanks, trucks, jeeps, and airplanes for the American forces. To everyone's surprise, though, Edsel died before Henry in 1943 from stomach cancer. When Henry Ford died in 1947, his net worth was equal to $200 billion, making him one of the richest men to ever live. But his company was a different story. Ford was passed to the next generation, Henry Ford II, also known as Hank the Deuce, and the founder's grandson had inherited a sinking ship, which was losing $10 million each month, equal to $200 million today. With the end of the conflict in Europe, factories had been decimated, along with communities, workers, and vital infrastructure. Henry II remade the company's executive level, replacing management with talent from elsewhere, including elite members of the Army Air Force statistical team. Under this leadership, Ford expanded aggressively and established itself as a global financial player, introducing the iconic 1949 Ford. And after negotiations with Ferrari fell through to acquire the Italian company, Ford developed the GT40 to bolster its presence in motorsport, which goes on to dominate the 24 Hours of Le Mans race. The GT line heralded an era of powerful sports cars for Ford, called pony cars, including the iconic Ford Mustang. The company went public in 1956, raising the equivalent of $7 billion. In 1987, when Hank the Deuce passed away, it was the first time the company fell out of the direct leadership of the family. Chapter 6: The Next Generation. Ford celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2003, and the 21st century marks a bold new era, with the company turning to EcoBoost engines and developing gas-electric hybrid SUVs. The company also underwent a significant restructuring through consolidation, job cuts, and more targeted product selection. Now, the Ford Motor Company is worth an estimated $125 billion, generating a $17 billion profit in 2021. Since 1999, Henry Ford's great-grandson, William Clay Ford Jr., has been the executive chairman of the company. He is the latest link in a family dynasty that began 120 years ago out of a small workshop in Detroit. Henry Ford's impact on society was enormous. He kicked off a revolution in the automobile industry, permanently changed how cars were manufactured, and how enterprises all around the world organized themselves. Ford turned determination, hard work, and uncompromising belief in himself into one of the most successful companies the world has ever seen.